But today we are here to attend the talk by Patrick Groeneveld, uh, and the title is "What Drives the Enduring Success of Electronic Design Automation." So Patrick is a lecturer in the Department of Electrical Engineering at Stanford University. He has a long career in electronic design automation work at both CASS and Synopsys. He was chief technologist at Magma Design Automation, where he was part of the team that developed a groundbreaking RTL to GDS2 synthesis product. Patrick also worked at AI hardware startups and was a full professor of electrical engineering at Eindhoven University. Uh, he serves as a finance chair in the executive committee of the Design Automation Conference, and Patrick received his master's and PhD degrees from the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. So thank you very much, Patrick, to accept our invitation, and the floor is with you to start your talk.
Thank you, Ricardo, for this wonderful introduction. Hope everybody can see the screen. So what I would like to talk about today is what makes electronic design automation tick. Yeah, so I want to go to the essence of the key algorithms that are there in the entire flow and see what are the adaptations and what things are actually driving certain decisions that we make. So what are we doing here in electronic design automation? What we want to be able to do is to go fully automated from a higher level description, like in this block diagram of a RISC-V processor, or from, your network description in PyTorch describing a machine learning architecture, and automatically convert that using a flow into hardware on the chip. Here I'm showing, an implementation of this RISC-V processor. And you see that the hardware, you can somewhat identify where the original blocks went, but a lot of the structure got lost or got mangled, and there's reasons why that is the case. Yeah, so here I draw some lines here. The instruction caches are the large blocks on the left. Those are pieces of memory. The data cache is on the right here, and then all the other parts like multiplier and floating point unit and the scoreboard or anything what issues and executes the instructions are mapped onto larger and smaller blocks. But a lot of the structure that you thought was there, that you would keep, let's say the original hierarchy, we actually get rid of that structure. And we get rid of that structure, you can call it for good reasons or for bad reasons. And I want to investigate in today's presentation kind of why that is and maybe what we can do different. So in a little bit more detail, say this flow that I just showed as one arrow here is actually a fairly complex transition where you go from a specification onto a system level description, and then from the system level description into an RTL description that gets automatically translated into a circuit description, and that gets translated into a mask physical the layout, which we can then produce on the wafer. We want this all automatic. Basically with the push of a button, you should be able to compile into silicon. That was our dream starting from the 1980s, but in practice, we have been fairly successful, but not entirely, and reasons why I would like to address in this presentation today. If you look at these levels of abstractions here, it's important to distinguish the tools that design, like logic synthesis tools, which bring you from RTL to circuit, or a placer and router, which bring you from circuit to physical, and contrast that to the verification tools, which basically verify, is what's implemented on the mask the same as the circuit, or does the circuit match the RTL or otherwise. There's a whole big industry in analysis tools and in synthesis tools. Generally, the synthesis tools run faster, they are more bumpy, they are more problematic, whereas the analysis tools run a little bit slower, but they give us more accurate results. Yeah. So the magic of design automation is actually that these abstractions levels that we have here in between, the RTL, the circuit, and the mask, we can reason on them and we can modify the circuit and we can predict what happened to them at every level fairly well, and in that way steer to a better and better implementation. And if possible, without any manual interaction. That's what we're after. Because typically, if you are a machine learning person and you want to implement a large language model, you are not an expert in logic synthesis, place, or route. Yeah, you want that to be automatically translated. Can be trusted that it gets automatically translated without manual interaction. In practice, it turns out that it always requires some manual interaction, but we want to minimize that, and that has to be done using algorithms. Actually, algorithms, I am here showing that there's actually not just one or two, but in a typical design flow, we have several hundred individual algorithms chained together. And that makes that flow very complex compared to, what we're used to. I mean, if you just say, what is a large language model and implement that on a set of GPUs, it's just one algorithm that's running. Here we have hundreds of algorithms running, and that creates complex interactions that, require quite some knowledge to make it work. Huh? So quickly, how we go there, we go from high-level synthesis, which does, resource allocation, decides how many adders we want, schedules operations to clock cycles, logic synthesis, it goes from RTL into a map netlist with some minimizing of area. Then we'll go to some optimization. That's basically to improve the timing. Then we go into a placement step and also a global routing step. Then we do again some optimization, sizing and buffering. Then we again add some refinement by inserting the clock tree, and we do a detailed placement, and then we again some optimization, and then we do an actual routing, and then we do again some optimization. So there's many steps in between, and going from the top to the bottom here might take 1.5 weeks if it's fairly large. Yeah. And of course, the trick is, first of all, I want this to run without any user interaction. Secondly, I want if some interaction required, I would like to automate that. And we see now some machine learning approaches to do that, that can do that without manual interaction to figure out what the problem is and improve things. So those are the things that I want. I don't want individual people to worry about individual wires. Because A, it's hard to understand what's cause and effect. And B, there's so many of them. Yeah, we have many millions of wires over here that are the result of maybe just a few lines of code here at the very top of the design. So there's many tools in this flow. There's also a deep hierarchy. Typically, if you come in, it's a large design, contains many components. The components contain subcomponents, which contain again of subcomponents. However, if you look how we implement this physically, and that's what I want to hammer on in this presentation, is that the standard cell is kind of our main Lego block, or the important block that we built from. And the standard cell implements a simple logic function, like a two-input NAND or an inverter, like in this case. And then we put a lot of those standard cells together, and we throw them in this place route flow, and we automatically connect them. So you see, we kind of skip or get rid of a lot of the intermediate levels of structure that we used to have in the original design. And I want to investigate now why that is. Because then if we have these blocks, we put some of these blocks together, and that is how we make our chips. We'll look in a moment at a few of the examples, how we get in there. Okay, so standard cells, yeah. So if I have a look, if I look at an actual floor plan, let's see, you can identify them with the naked eye. Yeah. So if I'm here and put up a laser pointer, it doesn't stick. If you see here at the right top, you see these cloudy areas. Those are probably hundreds of thousands or maybe 1 million standard cells, and then these blocks around them here, they are typically memory macros there that are connected. But everything else is collected and flattened together into a large set of standard cells. So standard cells is our universal building block. Yeah, and then we put some of them together. We make larger organs, and a set of organs, all of them together, makes the entire organism, which in this case it is a smartphone chip. Yeah. In a few more details, you can see that we like to put them in square blocks, rectangular blocks, because that's easier just from a abstraction perspective. We need to have interconnect in between those blocks. Sometimes it's over the blocks and sometimes it's in channels in between. You need to worry about, is that wide enough to carry all the wires? And we want to be very, very efficient with how we do that, because a company like Apple makes maybe 200 million of these chips. And if you calculate that, that would be several, maybe 6 or 7 acres of silicon. So that has a tremendous multiplier. If you can make that 5 or 10% smaller, it means a tremendous amount of money. So the other structure that you can already identify here with the naked eye is that some areas are denser, some areas are less dense. So some of the clouded areas here within the standard cell, they're for some reason dense. I'll show that in a moment in a little bit more detail. The key, though, is again that we build from standard cells, and that distinguishes, I think, electronic design automation from many other fields like mechanical design. You can think of a standard cell as a Lego block, and you can build from Lego blocks anything you want, but you're kind of limited in how you can express yourself. Here I built a house from Lego blocks, and it doesn't look very much like the original. So we really have this very pixelated abstraction of it. And also it wouldn't work that well in a physical environment, whereas in the electronic environment, we managed to make the standard cell abstraction work very well. So that causes a big difference between mechanical design automation and electronic design automation. In electronic design automation, we can design things that have billions of transistors. If I compare that to an airplane, there's only a few million parts. The development cost of a chip maybe is in the order of 50 million, maybe $100 million for a large complex chip, and smaller chips are cheaper. Development cost of airplanes, I never understood why it is that much, but we're talking tens of billions of dollars for the airplane for this size. And I don't really understand, because airplanes haven't changed shape that much in the past 50 or 60 years. It's a fuselage that's round, 4 engines. So why does it take so long to design this? There's something wrong in that design methodology, because we have been able to automate that in the electronic world. And that is possible thanks to standard cells. And it's also because, an airplane made out of Lego blocks doesn't work that well. But then there's similarities still with the mechanical design automation world. So if you look at the market, so total amount of dollars in, let's say, everything that has to do with aircraft design or architectural design, everything physical together is also, mechanical CAD world is in the order of $8 to $10 billion per year. EDA software is now a similar order. So those things are very similar. The difference is that EDA software per seat is a lot more expensive, because we have fewer designers doing that, and there's many architects in the world who buy an AutoCAD license for $500 or maybe $1,000 per year. So fewer users, therefore lower price of the software. But core is still a lot less automation. The other thing to think about is that we build things from standard cells. Airplanes are not built from standard cells. They have all kinds of different materials that are fused together and bonded together. But we, as humans, or all living organisms in the world, are also built from standard cells. If you look at a standard cell library that is used to design a chip, it maybe consists of 200 different cells. Well, guess what? Our body, the human body, also has a standard cell library of just 200 different cells. Every cell in a standard cell consists of 2 to 20 transistors, a few wires and vias. And the standard cell in our body, the human cell, is way more complex. It has nuclear ribosomes, membranes, all kinds of stuff. And it took evolution, the better part of 3 billion years to put this together. And then at a certain moment during the Cambrian Revolution, suddenly composability was discovered, and nature figured out that by combining standard cells, we can build organisms. And in the human body has 37 trillion standard cells. Whereas, okay, the current chips is more like 3.7 billion. So we are there a little bit smaller still than than the human body. Also, we're designed very differently. We are designed and constructed bottom up, whereas chips, we design them top down. We design and we run the flow through and there. But then again, there's a similarity. Our power consumption as a human, as we're sitting here now, is about 400 watts. A good graphics processor in a PC is also 400 watts. We have also infrastructure like clock networks and power wires. You can also find similar structures in the human body. But there's some other difference again then. I mean, the human body is very good at self-healing. Electronics doesn't heal itself. It needs to be repaired externally. Human body has all kinds of failure mechanisms that eventually cause it to die. I mean, the mean time before failure of a human is about 80 years. Every cell in our body needs to renew in about 8 years, whereas the electronics also dies after a while, but then due to heat or electron migration. But the economic lifespan of components is more in the order of 3 years rather than 80 years. And finally, of course, we are entirely recyclable, and unfortunately, electronics gets barely recycled, so only 16% gets collected, and then of that, maybe less than 1% of the materials can be recycled. So we have a little bit of way to go there. But again, I thought it was kind of interesting to look at that comparison because we are approaching this scale, and the scales, of course, has to do with the progress of Moore's law, which more or less started well over 100 years ago, where we are now at a scale of, that makes entirely new things possible, like integrated machine learning hardware. To drive home that scale and to go back to when we started, in 1965, Gordon Moore published a paper. But if you look a little bit earlier, there is already here in 1963 in NOR gate, 2-input NOR gate cost $25, one per piece. So this is actually a purchase order for our Texas Instrument for the Apollo project. And already then they figured out that, hey, integrating makes sense. And they could already plot graphs that look this is a graph from 1962, where they already said, hey, a few months later, that same chip doesn't cost $25, but it only costs $15. And they very quickly figured out that to land on the moon, integration is the way, and it will make great progress. So where we are, I mean, here I've kind of plotted chips from 1964, until today. And the vertical axis here is logarithmic, so every line is a factor 10, so that looks very deceptive, but it's fairly dramatic. The Intel 4004 from the first microprocessor was about 2,000 transistors. The famous Motorola 6800 had 68,000 transistors. That's why it was called like that. And then we had many generations where we are now. I mean, in the Apple iPhone now, the latest, and we're waiting, of course, what will happen next month when they announce a new one. But the current one iPhone 14 has 16 billion transistors. If you look at the other largest chips that you find, for instance, in a laptop, the A16 processor, the M2 processor in an Apple laptop is 40 billion transistors. NVIDIA GPUs, the larger ones of those, are 80 billion. Xilinx FPGAs are also in that order of magnitude. So we're talking closely to 100 billion on a single chip. And then if you do interesting things like, wafer scale integration, you can get to 2.4 trillion transistors. Or if we're talking about flash memory, where we stack up to 230 layers on top of each other, a 2 terabyte NAND flash memory is 5.3 trillion transistors. That is quite an achievement. And it's always interesting to compare that to, say, some worldly things that are also large, and to say, we're really designing things that are at astronomical scale. So the number of hairs we have on our body is in the order of 100,000. There's 8.9 million species of animals on Earth. We have 7 billion people on Earth, which is less people than there are transistors in the phone that you currently have in your pocket. The age of the universe is 30 billion, and we have about 80 billion neurons in our brain. At the same time, we can make chips that also have 80 billion transistors. So we get fairly close. It doesn't want to say that, a transistor is equivalent to a neuron in a chip, because a neuron has a lot more connections. But we're definitely getting to, literally astronomical scale, because, number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy is in the order of 100 billion. Yeah. Relentless scaling has completely changed society also as a result, because of that, we can make artificial intelligence, which is based on brute force calculation, which is only possible thanks to what you see in this graph. And that has to be efficiently designed automatically. Then again, you will wonder, hey, when will this end? Well, we've heard many, many times before, hey, it ends, we hit the laws of physics. But then if you look closely, these algorithms, these newspaper articles, they are already from more than 20 years ago, and we still have been happily going on. To prove that point, let's have a quick look at the chips that are in Apple iPhones. Here, and I always take here the iPhone starting from 2010, which is the iPhone 4, until the very latest, which is from last year's iPhone, 2014. And if I put them and keep the transistors at the same scale, this is what you get. So this is the iPhone from 2010, which has much less than 1 billion transistors. And now I'm going to scale with every iPhone generation and keep the transistor scale the same. So just to drive home the point, how much has changed from 2010 just to 2022. State of the art of 2022. Now we are 2022. We are at 50 times. So 50 times more transistors in the phone that we have in our pocket today than we had in 2010. There's no other technology that did something similar. So here it is drawn on a non-logarithmic scale. So you really see this curve happening. Seems to be flattening a little bit here now, and I'm very, very curious what the next iPhone will be. How many billion transistors are there? Whether it picks up again or whether it was a temporary dip. But now let's look from the same period from 2010 to 2023. For instance, for cars, here I looked up and say, hey, what's the fuel economy and what's the average power of a car in 2010 versus 2023? We see that cars maybe got 1.2x more efficient and 1.2x more powerful on average. It's probably even less in practice, but this is, the official data. So we see here that there's no other field in the world where we have these reliable factors rather than just a few percents improvement. And with what are we doing with all of this additional real estate? Well, let's have a look. Well, first of all, is it that much more meaningful to have so many more transistors in it? Because if you look at your iPhone 4 from 2010, it could do FaceTime, it had Google Maps, it had GPS. It basically did almost everything what you did with the current iPhone that suddenly needs 50 times more transistors. There's a law that describes it, say that the perceived usefulness of a new product is the technology's logarithmic function, meaning that keeps us, of course, very much busy, and it puts a challenge on design automation, because it just means there's a tremendous amount of appetite for transistors to to give us a linearly or barely perceived improvement in functionality of what we do. So what do we do with all those extra transistors? So let's have a quick look here at one iPhone chip and then an iPhone chip 5 years later, which has 10 times the number of transistors. Now, if you just identify the same objects, then in this case, there were 2 CPUs. Currently, it's 6 CPUs, a big little architecture. Relatively, it got smaller. The GPU also got relatively smaller, and we added a neural processing unit to specific hardware to perform machine learning inference. But the most important thing that we see happening is that we have many, many more blocks here that we invest in, and they are hardware accelerated. But basically what we're doing is we're taking things that would normally run on the CPU or the GPU and harden it in a block, and in that way get maybe factor 100, in many cases a factor 1,000 less power consumption. So we kind of convert the capabilities, the extra transistors what we have to improve battery life. And if you follow the trend or see how things look like, let's have a look. This is the chip. This is an Apple chip from 2018 from the iPhone XS, so iPhone 11. You can see the structures that I showed you earlier as well, but now at a much larger scale. All these dark rectangles, they're pieces of memory, and the gray C in between are standard cells. And here I manually drew what I think are the blocks, because this is actually an actual chip photograph from a chip then you can see that, okay, sometimes they're two the same blocks. The standard cells are the standard cells are in a big blob in the middle, whereas the macros, the memory blocks are pushed on the side, and then we assemble them together into a large chip. So you see again the 3-level hierarchy. Standard cells, we make blocks from them, and then we place those blocks. That is the structure that we see here. You see, in this case, there's about 100 blocks. So it becomes quite an interesting challenge to put this together. We want to do this automatically, but I can tell you that there's a lot of manual interaction still in swapping blocks and coming up with a better placement of this. So it's something that we haven't really addressed it, and I'll come back to that later as well. If I look at the past 5 years of Apple chips, you can see a trend that if I highlight here every one of these blocks, you see that the neural net, the amount of silicon area that's invested in machine learning is increasing, and that's very natural also because, it's very brute force calculation, and it really helps to harden that into efficient computational hardware rather than run it on a GPU or on a CPU, which is 100 to 1,000 times more less power efficient. So that's the trend that we saw. You see, the other trend that we see is this cache memory. Unfortunately, memory doesn't scale as well in 5 nanometer, or you see below 10 nanometer. So relatively, the size of the cache memory needs to get larger on the chip to keep up with the cache architecture that you want. Okay, so as I said, we have hundreds of steps in this flow to design every one of those blocks, and then we put those blocks together. I quickly want to go over how the most important step in making that transition from a high-level description into a physical implementation. That is placement. That is global placement. Where do we place these blocks? And what we are placing here are standard cells. We're not placing blocks, but we are standard. So I want to look at the algorithm, how we do standard cell placement, and from there on reverse engineer why we do it in this way and why we didn't make many more smaller blocks and assemble those together. So if you look at the history of standard cell placement, earlier on, we did that by, breaking the design into pieces and then breaking those design into pieces, every time minimizing the number of wires that go over the cut line, and that's what we call min cut. Then in the 1980s, we figured out that stochastic simulated annealing actually works better than we are randomly swapping cells and slowly driving it to a more optimal solution. And then in the 1990s until today, we went to numerical methodologies where we solve 2-use matrices, and I'll show that in a moment. And maybe now onwards, we can look at machine learning-driven methodologies, and I'll talk about them as well. I want to focus on this rather than on many of the other hundreds of algorithms here, because I think this is one of the most key steps in making this transition from in hardening the design into something physical. And the key and the beauty here is that will formulate this as a mathematical problem placement. And mathematics likes a really, really simple abstraction of the world. And what they will just say here in this case is that we'll assume that the standard cell is a point. So we don't worry about whether it's large or small. And we assume that the net between those standard cell is like is an edge in a graph that has a particular weight. And what we'll be doing is that we'll be minimizing the lengths of these edges, but we're not just minimizing the length, but we're minimizing the quadratic lengths. And quadratic length makes sense because delay on a chip is quadratic with the distance. But the reason why we do quadratic length here is because it has nicer mathematical properties. Yeah, so what we do is we want to minimize the total weighted quadratic wire length, which I can describe here as, okay, the sum of the differences between the x coordinates of a point and the difference between the y coordinates of a point, each of them squared times the weight, and sum that all over. So I'd like to find a good set of cell locations where this Q is minimized. And I will take this very small example with just 3 placeable cells as an example to walk you quickly through it, how it worked, and then see how it suddenly scales up to something that is really, really large and actually works. Yeah, so we are ignoring cell overlap, we are ignoring size. And the trick, the mathematical trick that is done here is that first we can observe that the x and the y coordinates, we can optimize them independently. Yeah, so it's the what we are after is just the sum of the squared of the x differences plus the sum of the y differences. So I can solve them independently. And so let's work first on the x and then on the y, and let's see how we do that. So I want to minimize this qx. How do we minimize qx? Well, that's just what we learned in high school. You differentiate and then set to 0. So this is, for this particular small example, the quadratic wire length that I see. So it's this location 0 minus the position of this point 1 squared times its weight, etc. I write it down here. I take the partial derivative of that towards x. So this is a square, that becomes 2x. This is also a square, that becomes 2x, and I revert that out. And over here, there is no x1 over here, so that's a 0. So I have this partial derivative. This is the equation I need to solve. That's the derivative towards x1. I can do the same towards x2. I can do the same towards x3. So now I have 3 sets of equations here and 3 unknowns that I can fix. Yeah. So let me rewrite them. I'm rewriting them here in matrix notation, where I'll have a 3 by 3 matrix C times the x is a fixed location vector D, which encodes this one. So here I'm writing it the same what as over here. I'm writing it in matrix location. And if I pick everywhere the weight as 1, this is the set of equations that I need to solve. It looks fairly straightforward. Yeah, and I can just fill in. And if I solve this for x, I know the locations, the x locations of these 3 points, and I can pop them in. And I know I have a minimized placement, and that's what I'm after. So let's do that. I'm solving that. And okay, I just pick some from the internet. I typed it in. You can just do it manually as well with whatever your favorite method is. I do that as well for y. And if I solve that, the solution of this one will be this, exactly what I expected. Yeah, so these points will be spanned up just like this rubber bands between the fixed point at the left bottom here and this point 4 at the right. And the 3 movable cells over here are exactly in the middle over here. Now this is the minimum wire length solution that comes out there. If I would change the weight, for instance, of this wire, this point 1 would move closer to this point over here. Yeah. Okay, another example here, something very simple. Yeah, now I have 5 movable cells and 3 fixed locations. Then again, you get a larger matrix. I will not go into every detail here, but this matrix has specific properties. It's diagonal, there's a lot of stuff, and it's very, very sparse. There's lots of zeros in there. Yeah, and if I fix that for x and y, solve it for x and y, you get this Christmas tree-like solution, what you would expect over here. Yeah, it looks a little bit like the Eiffel Tower. Now you think, okay, hey, this is only 5 movable cells. We have 5 million movable cells. Isn't that a problem? And you say, no, that's not really a problem because we know how to fix this. Now, there's several good approximation methods to solve this particular simplified or the matrices that are really sparse, that are diagonal, and that are symmetric. Yeah, there's just packages you can get, plug it in, and that's how we solve it. And that turns out to work just amazingly well. Yeah. So and this is kind of the key why physical design, or why we can automatically run this flow through without closing our things. So here, this is an example, and I'll show in a moment where this comes from, where every red dot here is a standard cell. In this case, there's 800,000 of them. Uh, the blue rectangles, they are macro cells. The task is to place these standard cells in the white areas in between of the blocks while minimizing the wire lengths. If I would do the method that I would show you here, where I say, okay, all the weights of all the wires is 1, minimize the total quadratic wire lengths given those weights, my solution, initial solution, would look roughly like this, where in this case we get 3 clusters. Yeah. So apparently the connectivity in that circuit just clumps together between these clusters, and then there's some connection between those clusters where you see some lines. So this almost looks like if you look through a telescope and you look at stellar clusters where things are attracted to each other and things want to stay away from. And it's also really modeled in a fairly similar way over here. So now this is of course not legal. This is not what I want. How do I bring it to a legal situation? Well, we're going to slowly add additional forces to every standard cell to pull it to the empty area, and also to make sure that the density in every area is roughly the same. And if you do that, I hope this is visible as well on the thing. This animates. It slowly it explodes, and then it gets pulled into the empty area, and you get a fairly good solution here. The tool here is called Replace. You can just download it from GitHub, from the internet. This is a state-of-the-art publication done by a team from University of San Diego. This is the methodology roughly, with, okay, all kinds of modifications, why things work. Yeah, and this is a fairly complex example. If I look at the block like this, it's fairly similar. Yeah, so initially they're all clustered together, then we push them apart, and they slowly go to still a minimal wire length configuration in between the cells that optimizes total wire lengths. There's a lot more to say about, okay, some details in here and how to make this efficient, but you can see while this expands, there's some clusters there. So some things like multipliers that want to stay together here, they're still somewhat visible here, but the algorithm knows how to blend all of this together and to kind of force it optimally in the available space between that. This is a successful methodology, and it only works because all these standard cells can be treated as a point, which means that we have to assume that standard cells are roughly the same size. Yeah. So we had originally a very hierarchical netlist, which contains all of these individual parts of these microprocessor that we saw. And then I break up all of the structure. The only thing that's left is the interconnections between the standard cells. And after I place it, you get this amoebic placement here. This was a design that I did a long time ago, and I colored the standard cells based on the names of the original blocks that they came from. You see that those are never really straight boundaries, and sometimes you get a block that gets distributed over different areas just because that's a shorter wire length operation. And that's also what you really want, because you kind of want to break up that hierarchy, that rigid structure, to allow things to flow into each other, and that way have a much better solution. But there's limits, of course. Until now, what we can do flat is maybe up to 10 million standard cells in one shot. That's still very large. I mean, that can be many microprocessors. But if we want to make chips that contain billions of transistors, I'll have several of those blocks, of course. What would happen as a next step, and I need to hurry up but I'm almost there, is that because the standard cells are small, what happens still is after that placement is still a fairly rough placement. If I look here at this small region here and I look at the standard cells, it would look like something here on the left where all the green standard cells, all the green things are standard cells. They're almost the same size. Some are a little bit larger, some are a little bit smaller. And then the next step is to legalize them and line them up neatly into rows. And after they line up neatly into rows, we'll run the router on those, and that works. So it's called detail placement. That's an easier step than the earlier step that I'm talking about here. Yeah. So if you look at that, how that looks like in practice, this was how it was done in Magma a long time ago, where, okay, all the green blocks here are the standard cells, and then you do the routing you route them, and then you have your circuit implemented. Okay, so we had these many tools in the EDA flow, yeah, and as I said before, one important step that is always happening here after we do such a placement step, we have a step, because what it does is it minimizes quadratic wire lengths. It doesn't minimize timing. It doesn't minimize congestion, really. So we need to do some optimization steps to improve things, especially the timing. So after every of these major steps, we have an optimization step, and there's 3 of them in most flows, where we size the gate, we buffer, we do some incremental placement, we do some other trickery to slam it back into shape. Then we do another step like clock tree synthesis and detail placement. Then the system gets perturbed and we need to fix a few things. Then we do routing, and then we again need to do trickery like this. So that's optimization. Then you can follow, at that point, you can follow the exact path that the wire takes. Most of the delay that we have to fight is as the result of the layer and the length of the wires. If we know that, at the moment we know that we can massage the circuit a little bit to optimize the speed of that using several trickery that we have in the flow. But generally what you can see is that each of those optimization steps, initially your accuracy is fairly rough, yeah. So you can be hundreds of % off after the first global placement still, because even though you know the location of the cells, you don't really know the layer they're in, or you don't really know their neighbors. Whereas after you did the exact routing, you're within 1%. So you get slower and more detailed the more deeper you get into the flow, but it gets harder and harder to make the modifications you get deeper in the flow. Also, if you look at the algorithms, yeah, you can make bigger changes at the beginning of the flow. So you have algorithms that do global placement, that want some hill climbing, that are sequential. Whereas later on in the flow, like in routing, we have faster, greedy algorithms, but they have to do a lot of data. So, and we can do that in parallel. Okay, so there's different problems in automatic placement. To come back too quickly to placement, yeah, the placement problem they show you was kind of the standard cell placement problem. We have the block placement problem, and we have kind of a mix of the two, and the mix of the two is actually what we need, yeah, where we have some macros and we have a bunch of standard cells on the side. Well, this one, I would claim we have solved at least reasonably using the algorithm that I just showed you. Block placement, despite decades of trial and errors, many algorithms here, we haven't solved it yet. It's not reliably giving us a good automatic solution for a problem like this. And that's just, and I'll come to that in a second. This one, yeah, we're somewhat in between. It's not really ideal, but we have ways to place these mixed together. Yeah. So why is block placement hard? Well, just my gut feeling is this, that if I have a given placement and I say I have this one and I want to improve it, I could say I can take 2 blocks and swap them. Or I can do some other operation, or I can do another operation. You see that each of those operations I do, even the smallest one that I want to do here, actually is a big step. Yeah, all these 3 alternatives here, even though they're derived from one position, they are wildly different in their wire lengths and their properties. So it's very hard to find the gradient, and algorithms like gradients, yeah, and you get easier gradients with many small blocks that have the same size than that you have in this case where you have large and small blocks that are mixed. The other thing is that we need an effective way to estimate whether this implementation is better than this or this one. And at this level, when you want to quickly know that, you cannot really properly estimate what the effect is of the wire lengths and all the other stuff with the congestion. Yeah, so that is not an easy thing. So I think it's unsolved, and I'm a little bit pessimistic that we'll ever be able to solve it. Maybe the answer to that is, hey, machine learning is good at seeing or learning from previous placement that have proven to be good or proven to be bad. And can we apply techniques that we see in machine learning now finally to EDA? And I think that is possible. Some of that work has already been published. This was an article in Nature that did block placement using using um, yeah, uh, machine learning techniques and used reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning, it basically places the blocks one after the other. It almost does placement like you play chess. Yeah? So you make one move at a time. In this case, the move is just adding the following block to the layout. And then if you do that a lot of times and learn from your previous mistakes, maybe you can automatically make something that comes up with better moves automatically. Yeah, placement is a very hard problem. It's harder than chess because it has many, many more states. But this sequential method of placement by itself is not that natural. Yeah, so that's basically what they propose here. First, they have one block, then they place the second, the third, and the fourth. The other method that I just showed you was say, okay, I have a placement. I'm changing it again, and changing it again. And then, okay, every time recording what's the best. And then at the end, I'll pick the best. Or I have something that's initially not legal and I slowly try to legalize this. Yeah. Of all these three methods, the last one is the one that seems to work somewhat. But in this paper, they used the first one. And yeah, that's is not that great. I will not go that into detail how this works. The point is that it just places the blocks one by one based on patterns that it has learned previously. That is not a bad idea, but the results have not been that enticing. So after this paper was published, it claimed very good results. Then several people have tried to reproduce it, and unfortunately, in the reproduction, we have. Recently was another paper published that we basically don't see. At least out of the box, this any improvement, or actually in general, it's worse than even the older simulated annealing method that we already have been using since the 1980s. And then the bad news is that it uses a lot more CPU resources to do that. Yeah, so in the order of hundreds of thousands of times more CPU to get similar results, or even worse results. Where I think machine learning might help us is that normally in EDA we have problems making meaningful use of additional processors. Yeah, we are tapering off. We cannot, there's Amdahl's law hurting us. And maybe with machine learning, if we have enough CPUs, in the end we can make things better. Whether this is the methodology that we saw, I don't know. Yeah. So in summary. Design automation works the way because we have homogeneous objects in the form of standard cells, and that works in logic synthesis as well as in physical placement. We also kind of make one effect dominate. So in this case I showed you is that we just assume that wire length is the only thing we care about, and then indirectly that will help us with congestion and with this timing. And we want to kind of keep things local. What we are not good at solving is heterogeneity, yeah, large and small together. If many objectives are working at the same time, which unfortunately is what we do have, and if there's complex interactions. Yeah, it's easier when things are static. It's harder when things are changing. Well, things are changing when you implement the flow, so that works a little bit against us there. And we like, of course, to find universal methodologies. Yeah, like this placement methodology. It really doesn't care whether you implement a process or a tool or anything else of what it does. Whereas the higher level you go, you need to have some very specific tools to get into very specific means. So custom makes things hard, and also hard for an industry to make custom tools for that. So in summary, I think that EDA methodology still, despite all our negativity that we have had in the past, we say, we're going to have a design productivity gap, Moore's law is racing ahead, we can't keep up. The practice is that we have kept up. Maybe we're slowly losing, but it's not that bad. But we still pull it off to design billion and even trillion transistor chips. Yeah. Thanks to certain algorithms that just have proven to work, and we need to change those together. The moment we're kind of looking for the successors of these algorithms, the next step would be to cleverly harness some machine learning methodologies. I haven't seen those really creep successfully yet into EDA tools, but I hope to see them soon. Okay, that was my presentation. I will be happy to take questions now.
So thank you very much for this very nice talk, Patrick. So the ones that want to do questions to Patrick, please do it as soon as possible using the chat channel. So I see for the moment no questions yet. So I have one. So one point nowadays is that using the traditional standard cell methodology based on the use of commercial cell libraries,
Yeah.
Finally at physical design level, we are quite far away from optimization because we cannot implement any function because not all functions are available in the cell library.
Yeah.
So we are doing here automatic layout synthesis and willing to be able to do the synthesis of any optimized the circuit at logic level, reducing in a significant way the number of transistors and by consequence the static consumptions and so on. I know this is a big change in the traditional we have nowadays.
Yeah.
So what is your comments about this?
Yeah, so those are, first of all, those are good efforts, and the thing why standard cell works is importantly that the cells are the same size, and I think in this case that is still the case. What comes out of your methodology, if you generate standard cells on the fly, you can still go through a similar implementation methodology. So I don't think there is a big hurdle to add these capabilities to existing flows, and then you'll just make things better. The problem that you have if you generate standard cells on the fly is that there's a lot of verification that goes on in the physical validation of the cells that come out of that methodology. Because if you generate a large variety of cells, you have to show that there's no side effect and it actually works. And if you buy a standard cell library from TSMC or whoever makes those, they kind of guarantee that this block works and you don't have to worry about that. If you make your own standard cells, you are responsible for all the complexity that's inside of the standard cell, you need the channel to fix that, and that is feasible. But the trick of the standard cell is that you don't have to worry about those details.
Yeah, but anyway, nowadays, even with the standard cells, we have all the problems with the delay in the routing that we are going to have a precise idea after routing.
Yeah.
So our point of view is that we should see the layout as a place and route of transistors and not anymore of cells. And for sure, we will need the tools to validate the design also automatically.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that works at a certain level. At the scale that I was just showing, where I have several millions of standard cells, my key problem is the complexity of that standard cells, and things will have to be spread out, and you have long wires and you have short wires, and you don't know exactly where they end up. So if you're at that scale, I think it's hard to incorporate such a methodology. If you're looking at a smaller scale, then it really makes sense to optimize at the transistor level the design. But this is a very interesting discussion. I think my storyline here was to say this is really, really big. Yeah, so I'm going to cut some corners. Yeah, and the corner I'm cutting is a simple standard cell library, and I'm not going to look too deeply into it. And in that way, I keep things somewhat manageable. And I hope that using composability of these standard cells, I can get still reasonable results. But that's obviously not always the case. But if you see what happens now, and if you see, for instance, how state-of-the-art chips, and like the one I showed you, I mean, all the chips from NVIDIA, from Apple, they are just made using standard cell methodology at this moment. Whereas in the past, they were made more with individual transistors because people thought that that helped. And it does help, but they just cannot afford the effort anymore to design them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question by Professor Altamiro Suzin.
Yeah.
Thanks for the good talk. I have a
Yeah.
question. You have always present a linear flow.
Yeah.
You never come back if some restriction is not met, for
Yeah.
example.
Very good question. That is indeed what I'm just presenting here is a linear flow. Within that flow, there are some loops, of course. I mean, every optimization loop is, okay, timing analysis flow, looking at what's critical, doing some optimization and doing that a number of times until things stop improving. But at the big picture, it's a linear flow. And at a certain moment, you look at the results, you say, not so good, I need to improve that. What we see now happening is with both tools from Cadence and Synopsys is that task of now, okay, the result, I run through this linear flow. I don't like the results. What do I do to improve it? Then, okay, you would look at some reports and you would tweak a little bit your RTL or move the placement or whatever, do a few things. That now what seems to be successful now is to use machine learning for that, to automate that analysis and then use machine learning to drive the modifications that you want to make to your design. That obviously works already because just by running the entire flow a number of times and even by making some small modifications just because of the noisiness of the flow, you will easily find 10-20% difference in quality of result just by small changes that shouldn't have that big of an effect. But this flow itself is noisy. It makes early on choices. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them have side effects that you don't really cannot predict. And then just trying many runs in parallel and picking the best helps. Driving or figuring out whether there's somewhere a gradient and can get you to a better solution would be better, of course. And that is what these machine learning methodologies like Cerebrus AI and DSO AI, as I believe it's called from Synopsys, what they are doing behind the scenes. But in the end, it's basically running the flow brute force many times and hope that there's a good one in between. So yeah, there is a big loop, and there's only that amount of times that you can run this loop if it takes a week to complete all the way through. Of course, you're not going all the way through to layout if you already discover at the first 3 steps that, okay, it's infeasible to do, and then you run only that earlier flow. But yeah, interesting. So if restrictions are not met, that's the job of what currently designers are doing, and we want to automate that designer partially using machine learning. What I would like to get at is something that does that inside of the flow, because it's really expensive to run the flow over and over again to have hoping there's a better methodology.
Thank you. So I see no more questions in the chat channel. So I'd like to thank you again, so Patrick, for this excellent talk in a very interesting subject. So we have nowadays in real time, we have a participation from people from India, France, USA, Brazil. So I have another question here by Suzin again. Will we ever design with standard cells or design transistors on the fly? So this is
that's what we basically a little bit discussed there. So I think that most of the designs will be continue to use standard cells. Certain applications might work with design on the fly. Again, having standard cells as Lego blocks that you build things and having only a limited set of those makes things simpler because you not have to worry about the quality of each of these individual Lego blocks that we are using for that. Yeah, they are fully qualified. We know exactly how good they work. And so So I think we will see designs that have transistors on the fly, but the bulk, and especially the large designs that I showed you, I think will still be entirely standard cells.
It could be a library of transistors already qualified.
Yeah, well, basically, then you made a standard cell library on the fly, or standard cell library if pre-qualified, but then it's just you enlarge the standard cell library. My previous experience, but that's a long time ago, is that if you don't tweak the logic synthesis to effectively use those standard cells, um, it was really interesting then to look at the user statistics of standard cells and to see that most of you have in a standard cell library that has 200 cells, and of those 200, 98% is just the top 10 different kind of cells that are there. And all the other 90s are not used or are barely used. Yeah, and so you really have to focus then on the design, on those standard cells that make a difference. And if they make a difference, then likely the people who make the standard cell library have already thought of those. Yeah. So there's and typically those could be very large drive strengths or particular drive strengths that might be missing in your standard cell library.
Okay, thank you very much again. So
Thank you.
just short announcement before closing. So next week we are not going to have a CASS talk, but you have more than 150 talks available in this YouTube channel that if you have not yet attended to all them, you can use this opportunity to catch some of the interesting talks that are available. So soon we are going to announce the next one that should be in 2 weeks. But it appears another question here by Fabio Santos from Senai Microelectronics in Manaus.
Yeah.
So considering huge systems like those in Cerebras, EDA is of utmost importance. Could you please elaborate on how to consistently develop such large-scale products with such automated tools?
That's also a good question. So if you look at the Cerebras or also other machine learning architectures, they are a two-dimensional array of very similar processors. Yeah. So from an EDA perspective, you design that processor, which is not that small, not that big, yeah, itself. And then you replicate it many times, and then you need all kinds of infrastructure around it. But by itself, that design is not at the same scale of complexity as a smartphone chip that has many, much bigger variety of blocks on board. Yeah. So therefore, and then thanks to efficient EDA tools, it is possible to design the world's largest chip, which is what Cerebras, which is really the size of a dinner plate, but it is a replication of the very same design all over again in a very, very clever way. Yeah. So the problem then gets shifted from not so much the design automation of the silicon, but the design automation of the mapping of your machine learning application onto that programmable silicon that you have. And that turns out to be quite challenging to do right. Yeah. So because now you kind of need to have an automatic translator that normally either it would translate into GPUs and now it translates into your machine learning hardware. And doing that consistently, efficiently, is quite some work and takes quite some software effort. So that is also a similar software stack that contains all kinds of tools that can look very similar, at least partially similar to what you do in EDA, and that needs development. A lot of that is proprietary work, but it's not an easy flow in general, and as polished flow yet as we see now, for instance, from logic synthesis downward to layout.
So thank you very much again, Patrick. So we are going to have the opportunity to see you in person here in Porto Alegre in November for the CASS workshop. So the CASS workshop will be Thursday, Friday, 16, 17 November. So the ones that have the opportunity to come to Porto Alegre can meet in person Patrick during the CASS workshop.
Yeah.
So thank you very much again, and see you soon, and see all you in next. Well, there is another question, Plat.
Okay. No. Yeah.
So Felipe Bortolom from thanks for the talk, Patrick. What
Oh,
are
yeah.
your thoughts on backside power delivery and its impact on detailed routing?
So I think your question is, so we have normally silicon, and then we have metal 1, metal 2, metal 3, many, many layers on top. And traditionally, we would have power in most of the intermediate layers, but the bulk of the power distribution would happen in metal 8 or metal 9, where you have very wide thing. And of course, it would help to say, hey, can I move some of that, maybe the power and the clock distribution, to the backside of the silicon? That's a technological problem because it would require you to make through the silicon holes, which could be fairly large. But yeah, that could be possible to make. I am not an expert in what the latest state of the art is in enabling that. I would think that might help, but still, if you look now, since we dedicate the highest metal layers already for that, and they are very, very thick, and they're mainly dedicated only for clock and power distribution, the solution we have is already reasonable, I think. But it might not be worth the additional trouble of delivering power on the backside of the silicon. But I don't know. That could change if there's a radical and new technology.
Okay, so thank you again. So see you in our next CASS talk. So
thank you. Bye
bye
bye.
bye. See you. And